The north is cold and full of whispers.
The stairs smelled of copper. Ned Stark had climbed them with a sword in his hand and Lyanna's name in his chest, and what he found at the top was not what songs prepare a man for. Songs do not describe the smell. They do not describe the way blood moves when there is too much of it, how it finds the low points in the stone, how it collects in the gaps between the flags like dark mortar, how the torchlight makes it look black at the edges and red at the center and every shade of wrong in between. Lyanna was on the bed. She was still breathing. That was the first thing he confirmed, because he needed to confirm it before he could do anything else. Her chest rose. It fell. Each breath had a wet quality to it that meant something was wrong inside. Something he had no maester and no knowledge to fix, and the sheets around her hips were soaked through with the particular red that comes from childbed and does not stop. She turned her head when he came in. Her eyes found him. Something moved across her face that was not quite relief and not quite grief, and was perhaps both of those things folded into each other so tightly they had become a third thing with no name. "Ned," she said. Her voice was barely a voice. It was the shape of a word rather than the word itself. "I'm here." He crossed the room in 4 steps and took her hand, and her fingers closed around his with a strength that surprised him. "I'm here, Lya. I'm here." The baby was in the corner of the room, wrapped in cloth that had been torn from a white cloak. The white cloak of the Kingsguard. It was breathing, he could hear it, a small wet sound, the involuntary noise of something new and utterly defenseless, and it was this sound, more than anything else. That made Ned understand the full weight of what he had walked into. He had not noticed Arthur Dayne yet. He noticed him the way you notice something large and still in a room that should be empty, a wrongness at the edge of perception that the eye keeps sliding away from, because the mind has decided it cannot be there. Arthur was propped against the far wall beneath the window, his back against the stone, both hands pressed to his left side where the wound was. Howland Reed's knife. It had gone in at an angle that would have killed most men already, and had apparently decided, for reasons of its own, to give Arthur Dayne slightly more time. Dawn was on the floor between them. The sword lay where it had fallen, point toward the stairs, and even in the torchlight, even covered in the evidence of the fight that had ended 4 men dead in the yard below, it was luminous, pale as a winter star. The kind of pale that does not belong in a room full of blood. Ned looked at the sword. He looked at Arthur. Arthur's eyes were open. "You know what this child is," Arthur said. His voice was level. Not the voice of a dying man performing composure, the voice of a man who had already run through the mathematics of the situation and arrived at the only viable solution and was now simply waiting for the other man in the room to catch up. Ned did not answer immediately. He looked at Lyanna. She was watching him with those gray eyes, Stark eyes, their father's eyes, the same eyes he saw in his own reflection, and there was something in them that was asking him something, and he knew what it was asking even before she found the air to say it. "Promise me, Ned." Her grip tightened on his hand. "Promise me." The baby made its small sound in the corner. Ned looked at Arthur again. Arthur had not moved. He was bleeding through the cloth at his side with the methodical patience of a man who has decided that bleeding is simply a thing that is happening and does not require his attention. "You should be dead," Ned said. "I am," Arthur said. "As far as anyone outside this room needs to know, I am." A pause. "How many of your men are below?" 6 rode in, 2 survived. He did not say their names yet. He would say their names later, when there was room to grieve. "Howland is outside. Howland Reed." Something moved in Arthur's expression, not quite approval, not quite its opposite. He is a man who understands the difference between what happened and what needs to be said. "You're asking me to lie. I am asking you," Arthur said, "to make a decision. The decision your sister is lying there dying to ask you to make." He paused to breathe. The breath cost him something. "The yard below holds many dead. Your men among them, 4 of them, good men, who deserve to be grieved and named and remembered. Hightower and Went are there too, and a 3rd white cloak face down in the dirt, which no one outside this room will look at closely." He held Ned's gaze. Men who win a fight do not spend time on their knees examining every body beneath them. They examine themselves. They count who they have left, and they start moving. Ned stood up from the bed. He walked to the corner where the baby lay and crouched beside it and looked at it for a long moment. The child had dark hair and a face that was scrunched with the effort of existing. Its eyes were not fully open yet, but the shape of the jaw, the set of something in the brow, Ned had seen that shape before. In oil paintings. In the sept at Riverrun, where a portrait of the old dynasty hung in the nave. He stood up. He did not pick the child up yet. "If I do this," Ned said, "if I say you are dead and ride north with this boy and call him mine, what happens to him? What happens to you?" "He grows," Arthur said. "Under my hand, in a place where Robert's reach cannot find him, in a place where what he is can be built rather than buried. And when the time is right, not now, not for years, he comes into the world as what he is." He shifted against the wall. The movement put a fine edge of pain across his face that he absorbed without expression. "Your sister does not have long. She has something to ask you. When she is done asking, there is only one answer an honorable man gives her. And then you leave, and I follow a different road south, and the world counts what it finds in that yard and calls it done." Ned turned back to the bed. Lyanna was still looking at him. Her chest rose, fell, the torchlight moved across her face, and she looked very young and very old at the same time, the way people do when something is ending and they know it. He sat beside her again. He took her hand again. She told him, in the broken currency of the breath she had left, what she needed him to know. His name. The truth of it. The marriage. The septon, and the words, and what Rhaegar had said to her the morning after, standing at a window in a tower much like this one, with the sun not yet risen and the desert below them cold and blue in the dark. She told him that she had not been stolen. She told him that she had been loved. She told him that the war was not her fault, and not Rhaegar's fault in the way the songs would say it was, and that she would die carrying that knowledge, and it was the one thing she asked him to carry for her. And then she told him the boy's name. And then she asked him to promise. Ned Stark made the promise with Arthur Dayne bleeding against the wall 10 feet away, and the cold air coming through the window, and the baby breathing its small wet breath in the corner of the room, and the word he spoke. Yes, was the smallest and most consequential word he had ever said in his life. She died before the sun came up. He did not have time to sit with it. Arthur was already moving, slowly, with the deliberate economy of a man managing the distance between himself and unconsciousness, gathering the child, wrapping it more securely in the remnants of the white cloak, checking the binding at his side with 2 fingers pressed flat against the wound. He did not ask for help. Ned did not offer it. There was an understanding between them that did not require language. At the door, Arthur paused. He looked at Dawn on the floor. He picked it up. He strapped it across his back with the methodical care of a man who knows that what he is carrying is not his own to leave behind. Then he walked to the window and looked south, toward the dark mass of the mountains, and whatever calculation he was making behind his eyes resolved itself into something quiet and settled. He did not look back at the bed. He left. Ned stood alone in the room for a long moment. Then he went downstairs. In the yard, Howland Reed was waiting. He stood among the dead, 4 of Ned's companions, their faces known, their names already forming in Ned's throat like stones, and he looked at Ned with the particular stillness of a man who had seen everything that had happened and was waiting to be told what it meant. Ned looked at the bodies. He looked at the 2 Kingsguard he could identify by their faces. He looked at a 3rd white-cloaked figure lying face down at the yard's edge, the pale blade gone from its back, the cloak muddy and still. Ned looked at Howland. The kind of silence that passes between 2 men who have understood each other without a word is not a comfortable silence. It is the silence of shared weight, and it settles onto both of them at the same moment and does not lift. 3 Kingsguard, Ned said. Howland Reed looked at the yard, at the white-cloaked figure. At Ned. 3 Kingsguard, Howland said. They wrapped their own dead with the care those men deserved, and rode north with the dawn. The Tower of Joy shrank behind them. The mountains swallowed the light. Somewhere to the south, on a road no one was watching, A dead man walked with a living child wrapped against his chest, and 14 years of silence already beginning to form around him, like stone around water. The world did not know yet what it had failed to kill. The keep had no name. It had walls, thick ones, built from the red stone of the mountains by someone who wanted to be left alone. It had a well that ran cold even in summer. It had a courtyard the size of a modest stable, ringed by crenellations that nothing taller than a hawk ever crossed, and it had a single tower with a single room at the top where Arthur Dayne slept, when he slept, and watched the approach roads when he did not. It had been abandoned for at least a generation before they arrived. Arthur spent the first month making it livable and the second month making it defensible, doing both with the same expression, which was no expression at all, merely the focused blankness of a man working through a list. The child did not care about any of this. The child cared about warmth, about milk, about the particular sound Arthur's boots made on the stone floor at night, which was the sound that meant someone was coming and everything would be all right. Arthur learned to move quietly. The first word the boy said was not mama, and it was not papa. It was a Dornish word for water, learned from the woman Arthur had hired from a village 3 hours south, a widow, discreet, who asked no questions because she had been paid enough gold to make questions seem exhausting. The second word was Arthur's name, or something close to it, a soft mangling of the consonants that Arthur corrected each time with the same patience he applied to everything, which was to say he corrected it once, clearly, waited, and corrected it again. By the time the boy was 2, he said it properly. The hot season came in from the south like something with weight. The mountains held the heat differently than the desert, pressed it into the stone and released it at night so that the air never fully cooled. Aegon slept on the floor in those months, having discovered that the stone was cooler than the bed, and Arthur did not argue with this logic. He was 3 years old, and he had already begun asking why. Why did the hawk circle before it dropped? Why was the well water colder in the morning than the afternoon? Why did Arthur always face the door when they ate? Arthur answered every question with the same economy he applied to everything else. Because the circle lets it see what's below. Because the sun warms the surface water last. Because I do not like surprises, no elaboration, no softening. The answers landed clean, and the boy caught them and turned them over and asked the next thing. Arthur watched this with something he did not name. He was careful about the things he named. The wooden sword was a length of dowling from the cart of a passing merchant, cut to size, and sanded at both ends so it would not splinter. Arthur wrapped the grip in cloth and handed it to the boy in the courtyard on a morning in early spring, when the light was thin and the stone underfoot was still cold from the night. "Hold it," Arthur said. Aegon held it. "Your hand," Arthur said. He crouched, put himself at the boy's level. He looked at the grip. "You are trying to keep it from leaving. Stop that. It is not going anywhere. Hold it the way you hold a bird, firmly enough that it cannot fly, lightly enough that you cannot feel your own pulse in your fingers." Aegon adjusted. The grip changed. "Better," Arthur said. He stood. Again, the boy swung it. The wood whistled through the air with more enthusiasm than technique. "Again," Arthur said. The boy swung it again, and again, and again, until his shoulder ached and the swing began to change, to flatten, to find something close to a line. Arthur crouched again, watched the line. "There," he said. "That? Do you feel the difference?" "It feels like less," Aegon said. "Yes," Arthur said. "That is what right feels like." Less, he stood. Again, history was taught without books, because there were almost no books. Arthur had 3, a military text in High Valyrian that he translated aloud as he read, a travelogue of Essos that was more useful for geography than anything else, and a slim volume on Targaryen succession that had been in the pocket of his white cloak at the Tower of Joy, and that he kept in a locked box at the top of the tower. Everything else came from memory. Arthur's memory was not merely good. It was the memory of a man who had spent 15 years at the center of the world's most powerful court and had understood, even then, that what he saw and heard was a resource. Names, dates, alliances, grudges, 3 generations old, that were still shaping which lords smiled at each other across feast tables, and which ones reached for their wine when the other man spoke. He taught it all. Aegon the Conqueror had 3 dragons, he said one evening. They were sitting at the base of the courtyard wall, the last of the light going orange above the mountains. He had 2 sisters. He had superior firepower and an enemy that refused to unite until it was too late to matter. That is the whole story. The songs make it complicated because the songs need to last 3 hours. Aegon was 8 years old and already asking questions that cost Arthur something to answer. If the dragons were the only reason he won, what happens when there are no dragons? Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then you need the next best thing, which is lords who are more afraid of what happens if you lose than of what you will ask them to sacrifice if you win. He looked at the mountains. Fear of chaos is a more reliable engine than love of kings. Remember that. The question about Ashara came on an unremarkable evening. They had eaten. The fire was low. Aegon was reading the high Valyrian military text by himself now, slowly, working out the translations by context, asking when he was stuck. He looked up at some point and studied Arthur's face in the firelight with the unself-conscious directness of a child who had not yet learned that certain looks are considered rude. "Did you have family?" Aegon asked. Before, Arthur's face did something. It went still, not the trained stillness of a man controlling a response, but the genuine stillness of a man who has been asked something that goes below the level where training operates. "A sister," he said. "Ashara," he paused. "She was the most remarkable person I have known. Besides your father." Aegon waited for more. More did not come. He looked at Arthur's face for another moment. Then he looked back at the book. He did not ask again. Not for years. But he did not forget, either, the way he did not forget anything Arthur gave him. The sparring had changed. Arthur had fought him at a quarter pace for 3 years, then a third. Now he came in at something approaching half speed, and the difference was not the speed, the difference was the intent. At half speed, Arthur was no longer performing technique for the boy to study. He was trying to find the gaps. He found them. But they were getting smaller. "You dropped your left shoulder," Arthur said, stepping back after a sequence that had ended with the flat of his blade against Aegon's ribs. "I know," Aegon said. He was breathing hard. "It drops when I commit right. I haven't fixed it. Why not? Because fixing it means I have to think about it, and when I think about it, I lose the commit." Arthur looked at him. "So what is the solution?" A pause. Aegon turned it over. "Train it until I don't have to think about it." "Yes," Arthur said. Again, they went again. The sun moved. The shadows in the courtyard changed direction. By the time the light failed, Aegon's shoulder had dropped 7 times, and Arthur had struck the same point on his ribs each time, with the same patient precision, like a man pointing repeatedly at something he wants the other person to see. On the 8th exchange, the shoulder held. Arthur stepped back. He said nothing. But he lowered the blade. That, Aegon had learned, was the signal. The maps came from memory too. Arthur drew them in the dirt of the courtyard with the butt end of a stick, crouching, scoring lines with the focus of a man who understands that geography is not landscape, it is leverage. The King's Road and the way it narrows at the neck, the Blackwater Rush and what it means for armies moving east from the Westerlands. The chain of fords across the Trident and which of them could be held by 500 men against 5,000, if the ground was right. "The realm is not 7 kingdoms," Arthur said. "It is 5 choke points and the land between them. Control the choke points and you do not need to hold the rest." He drew a circle at the center of the map. "This is King's Landing. Every road ends here. Every river points here. Whoever sits in that city can feed 2/3 of Westeros or starve them. That is not a coincidence. That is why Aegon the Conqueror built it where he did." Aegon studied the map. "The north is isolated. The neck cuts it off. Yes, so a Stark army marching south has to come through a single pass that any competent commander can hold with a fraction of the force." "Yes," Arthur said, "which is why the north has never been conquered militarily. You do not beat the north by fighting the Starks. You beat them by giving their lord a reason to come to you." He paused. "Or by being the kind of king they choose to follow, because the alternative is worse." Aegon was quiet for a moment. Which will it be? Arthur looked at him across the dirt map. The boy was 13 years old, and the question he had just asked was not a boy's question. It was the question of someone who had already accepted that these were problems he was going to have to solve. That, Arthur said, depends on who is left standing when the time comes. He smoothed the map with his boot, started drawing it again. Pay attention, he said. I am only going to explain the Blackwater once more. The raven came in the night. Aegon heard it. He heard everything. Arthur had spent years making certain of that, had drilled into him the understanding that the distance between a sleeping man and a dead man was determined entirely by the quality of his attention, and so Aegon slept lightly, and woke completely, and was already sitting up when he heard the birds settle on the tower above him, and the sound of Arthur's boots crossing the floor. Overhead. He lay back down. He did not sleep. In the morning, Arthur did not mention the raven. He made the fire, and they ate, and he drilled Aegon on Valyrian irregular verbs for an hour, and Aegon answered everything correctly and watched Arthur's face the entire time. Arthur's face gave nothing. It never gave anything. But there was a quality to his stillness that morning that was different from his ordinary stillness, a density to it, like a man holding something very carefully that he has not yet decided how to set down. After the verbs, Arthur said, "Leave the sword." Aegon had reached for it out of habit. He let it go. They walked to the base of the eastern wall, where the red stone held the morning warmth and a low shelf of rock made a natural place to sit. Arthur sat. Aegon sat beside him. Below the wall the mountain fell away sharply into a valley that was still purple with shadow, and beyond the valley more mountains, and beyond those, Dorne. Arthur looked at the valley for a moment. Then he said, without preamble, without softening, without any of the preparations a lesser man might have used, "You are not a bastard. You are not a secret. You are Aegon of House Targaryen, sixth of his name, the son of Crown Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and Lady Lyanna Stark of Winterfell, who were lawfully wed in secret before your birth." He said it the way he said everything that mattered, clean, even, with no decoration. The valley below was very still. Aegon did not speak immediately. He sat with it the way Arthur had taught him to sit with a difficult position on the training floor, not fighting it, not yielding to it, simply holding it until its weight became legible. Rhaegar Targaryen, Lyanna Stark. The names had weight in them. He had heard both before, in the history lessons, in the careful way Arthur had always spoken about the rebellion, always analytically, always from the outside, never with the small inflections that meant this was personal to me. He understood now why. "Who knows?" Aegon said. It was not a question. It was the first calculation. Arthur looked at him. Something crossed his face, brief, contained. Eddard Stark. Lord of Winterfell. He was at the tower when you were born. He rode north with you in his arms and told the world you were his. A pause. He has a remarkable capacity for silence, your uncle. He has kept this for 14 years at considerable cost to himself. Howland Reed, Aegon said. Yes, Lord of Greywater Watch. He was there as well. He has never spoken of it to anyone as far as I know, and I have been careful to know what I can. Who else? The Dayne family. Some of them. I have been careful about which. Arthur's hands were resting on his knees still. And Varys, the master of whisperers in King's Landing. I believe he suspects. I cannot confirm what he knows or what he has done with it. Aegon thought about Varys. He had heard the name many times, always in the context of a man whose value was precisely the impossibility of predicting him. He filed it and moved on. What about Viserys? Your uncle Viserys believes he is the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms. Arthur's voice was level. He is wrong. He has been wrong since the moment you drew breath at the Tower of Joy. Rhaegar's children inherit before Aerys's younger sons, that is Targaryen succession law, and it is unambiguous. Viserys is your uncle, not your predecessor. He won't accept that. No, Arthur said. Aegon let that sit. He had heard about Viserys too, from Arthur's carefully assembled picture of the current state of the world, from the rare letters that came through the Dayne network. from the fragments that added up to a portrait of a man who had been told he was owed the world and had spent his exile growing hollower and more dangerous in the place where certainty used to be. And Daenerys. Arthur was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something that was not quite emotion and not quite its absence, something in the space between. Your Aunt Daenerys is 13 years old and in Pentos. Illyrio Mapatis, a wealthy merchant with Targaryen sympathies and the kind of ambitions that dress themselves as loyalty, is currently arranging her marriage to a Dothraki Khal named Drogo. The sentence landed. Aegon absorbed it. 13 years old. He was 14. The distance between those two ages felt both very small and very large. She doesn't know about me, he said. No. Does she know she has another claim above Viserys? She does not know you exist, Arthur said. Very few people know you exist. That is the point. Aegon stood up. He walked to the edge of the wall's shadow and stood where the sun reached him, looking south. The heat was already building in the valley, distorting the air above the lower ridgelines into something that moved. He thought about the raven. He thought about Arthur receiving it in the night and lying awake with it, and then conducting an hour of Valyrian grammar as if the world had not shifted. The raven, Aegon said. What did it say? Jon Arryn is dead, Arthur said. Lord of the Eyrie. Hand of the king for 15 years. He paused. He was investigating something in King's Landing before his death. Something about the royal succession. He was a careful man and a thorough one, and he died very quickly for someone his age and health. The Lannisters. That would be my assessment. And Eddard Stark, Aegon said. He had already done the next calculation. Robert will name him Hand. He always trusts the man closest to him who hasn't failed him yet. He turned around. Stark is riding south. Arthur looked at him across the courtyard. There was something in the look that was different from the looks of 14 years of training, something that was reassessing, recalibrating, arriving at a conclusion about what it was looking at. Yes, he said. And when Ned Stark is in King's Landing, surrounded by Lannisters, with the secret he has been carrying for 14 years, and the honor he has been carrying for longer, he will last less than a year. Aegon said it without heat. It was not a feeling. It was an analysis. The window is opening, not because the moment is right, because it will only get worse. Arthur said nothing. Aegon walked back to where he had been sitting, and looked at the box Arthur kept at the top of the tower, the one that came down now and rested on the stone between them. He had known the box existed for years. He had never asked what was in it. He asked now with his eyes. Arthur opened it. Inside, a letter. The hand was unfamiliar, but the seal had been Targaryen. The wax was ancient, cracked at the edges, but the three-headed dragon was legible. Below it, a folded document in a different hand, older, with a Dornish septon's mark at the bottom. Below that, a list of names, written in Arthur's precise script, each one followed by a notation, deceased, 283 Ac. Deceased, 284 Ac. Living, last known location, Essos, living, Westeros, whereabouts uncertain. The witnesses, what happened to each of them? Aegon read the list carefully. Then he read it again. The septon who performed the ceremony, he said. Dead, natural causes, 289 AC. But records were kept. Dornish septons keep meticulous records. It is a point of institutional pride that the Dornish faith has never lost a document. Where are the records? In a sept, in the hills above the Greenblood. A pause. 3 days' ride from Starfall. Aegon folded the list back the way it had been. He placed it in the box. He closed the box and looked at Arthur. When do we go to Starfall? Soon, Arthur said. There is one thing we do first. He reached beside him. Aegon had not noticed, he had been focused on the box, that Arthur had brought Dawn down from the tower. The sword lay on the stone behind him, wrapped in rough cloth. Arthur unwrapped it. In the daylight, in the open air of the mountains with the sun fully up, it was something different from what Aegon had imagined. He had been told about it. He had heard Arthur describe it precisely and without sentiment, the way Arthur described everything, its dimensions, its weight, its origin, the metallurgical difference between a meteorite blade and Valyrian steel. He had built a picture of it in his mind from the words and thought the picture was accurate. It was not accurate. It was pale the way stars are pale, not colorless, but actively, pressingly white, a white that had its own quality of light rather than simply reflecting what was around it. The edge caught the morning sun and held it differently than steel should hold it. Looking at it for too long felt like looking at something that existed at a slight angle to the rest of the world. Arthur held it across both hands and looked at it for a moment. "I am not giving this to you," he said. "It is not mine to give. And you cannot be named Sword of the Morning. That title belongs to House Dayne by blood, and no ceremony or conquest changes that." He looked up. "But it will ride at your side. When the lords of Westeros see this blade, they will not need to be told what it means. They grew up on stories of Arthur Dayne the way men grow up on stories of fire, with understanding of it built into them before they were old enough to choose what they believed." He paused. "Dawn is the authentication. No forgery can replicate it. No pretender can carry it. When I draw it at your side, the argument is over before it begins." Aegon looked at the sword. He looked at Arthur. "You have been dead for 14 years, Aegon said. "Yes," Arthur said. "And now?" Arthur wrapped the sword again. He stood up. He was not a tall man by the measure of legends, compact, precise, built for efficiency rather than impression. But when he straightened to his full height in the morning light with dawn across his back and the decision already made behind his eyes, there was something about him that occupied more space than his body. "Now," Arthur said, "I am not." They traveled as merchants. Arthur had done this before. The Dornish roads were not unfamiliar to him, and the particular arts of making himself invisible had been learned not through training, but through necessity, which is always the better teacher. A beard that had been growing for 3 weeks, a merchant's rough-spun over the clothes beneath, a posture that was slightly rounded at the shoulder, a degree of forward lean that subtracted something from his height. He did not walk like Arthur Dayne. Arthur Dayne walked like a man who had killed everyone who had ever tried to stop him walking wherever he chose. The man on the road to Starfall walked like a man thinking about cargo weights. Aegon walked behind him with a horse's lead in his hand and said nothing for hours at a time, which was a skill Arthur had not taught him deliberately but which had developed anyway from years of living with someone who used silence as a default rather than a courtesy. The Torrentine came into view on the 3rd day. It ran fast here, white at the rocks, green in the deep channels, cutting its way down from the mountains toward the sea. They followed it west, and the air changed as the elevation dropped. Damper, saltier, carrying something that was not quite the smell of the summer sea yet, but was already reaching toward it. Starfall appeared at mid-morning. Aegon had heard Arthur describe it once. Briefly, the way he described everything that cost him something. Factually. Without flourish, with the clean precision of a man who had decided that precision was the only safe container for certain kinds of grief. Cliffs above the sea, old stone. The place where dawn was made, or where it came to rest. The distinction, Arthur had said, was a question the Danes argued among themselves. The sword was older than the castle. The sword was older than almost everything. What Arthur had not described was the way the castle sat. It did not sit on the cliffs the way a fortification sits, defensively with its back to the sea and its face to the threat. It sat the way something sits when it has been in a place long enough to become part of the place, the way a particular boulder becomes part of a hillside after enough centuries, until the question of whether it belongs there stops being meaningful. Starfall had grown out of those cliffs the way the cliffs had grown out of the earth. The Danes had not built it so much as organized what was already there. They came to the gate on foot, horses at their backs, looking like what they were supposed to be. The guards looked at them. Arthur said a name, not his own, a Dane retainer's name, someone who had been part of the thin chain of contact maintained over 14 years through letters that said very little and meant a great deal. The guards conferred. They waited. The gate opened. The woman who received them was not what Aegon expected, which meant he had been expecting something. He corrected that instinct and filed it. Lady Illyria Dayne was perhaps 35, with the silver-gold hair that the family ran to, and eyes that were a shade of purple that the Danes shared with no one else in Westeros, except the dynasty she was about to decide whether to support. She was not a large woman. She stood in the receiving room of Starfall's inner keep with her hands at her sides and looked at Arthur Dayne, her dead brother's ghost, walking and bearded and alive in her hall, for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "You look terrible." "I looked worse in the mountains," Arthur said. "That I believe." Her eyes moved to Aegon. They stayed there. She was not looking at his face the way people looked at the face of a boy. She was looking at the whole of him, the posture, the hands, the way he stood in a room he had never stood in before. Taking stock. Deciding something. "Leave us," she said. Not to Aegon. To Arthur. Arthur did not move immediately. A beat passed, brief, almost imperceptible. Then he walked to the door, and the door closed behind him, and Aegon was alone with the Lady of Starfall for the first time in the room that held, on its eastern wall, a rack of sword hooks that held no sword. Illyria Dayne looked at the empty rack for a moment. Then she looked at Aegon. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She did not. "My brother has spent 14 years making you," she said. "That is not nothing. I would like to understand what he has made." "Then ask me something," Aegon said. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. She walked to the window that faced the sea and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the water, and when she turned around her face, had changed into something that was not harder exactly but more honest. "My sister Ashara is dead," she said. "She jumped from the Palestone Tower. The sea took her. We never recovered the body." She paused. She had lost a child. A stillborn girl, born in the wrong season for a woman who had already lost too much. And before that she had lost everything the war took, which was considerable. She held Aegon's gaze. "Your father's choices contributed to the circumstances that broke her. I am not going to pretend otherwise to make you comfortable." Aegon did not look at the door. He did not look at the sword rack or the window or the floor. He held her gaze the way she was holding his. "I know," he said. "Do you?" "Arthur told me she existed. He told me nothing else, because there was nothing else he could tell me without breaking. But I am not blind, my lady, and I have spent 14 years learning to read what is not said." He paused. "Your brother carries her with him, the way men carry wounds that healed wrong. You can see it when something touches the right place." Illyria Dayne said nothing. "I cannot undo what the war cost your house," Aegon said. "I cannot give you Ashara back. I cannot give Arthur his sister back, or give your family the years that were taken from it, or tell you that none of it would have happened if my father had made different choices. Because it might have. It might not have." He stopped. "Let the honesty of that sit between them without decoration. What I can tell you is that the men whose ambition created those conditions are still alive, still comfortable, still in possession of everything the war gave them. And if I take the throne, that ends, not as revenge, as a reckoning. There is a difference." Silence. Illyria Dayne looked at him for a long moment. The light from the window was full on her face, and he could see her making the decision, not performing it, actually making it, working through the last of whatever the question had been. "Yes," she said finally, "there is." She went to the door and opened it. Arthur came back in. He looked at Illyria. She gave him nothing but a slight nod, and the quality of what left Arthur's shoulders in that moment was something Aegon had never seen leave them before. Then Illyria crossed to a door in the far wall, unlocked it with a key at her belt, and opened it onto a narrow staircase that descended into the rock. She went down. They followed. The room at the bottom was cut from the cliff itself, and it was cold in the way that deep stone is cold, not the cold of weather, but the cold of the earth's indifference. The temperature that has existed in that rock since before anyone built above it. The torches on the walls burned without flickering, because there was no wind this far down. In the center of the room, on a table of dark ironwood wrapped in oilcloth that had been changed many times over the years, was Dawn. Arthur crossed the room without hesitation. He unwrapped it himself. With the particular care of a man handling something that he knows is not fragile, Dawn had survived things that had not survived, but that merits care anyway as a matter of respect. He lifted it in both hands, and stood there for a moment with his back to them, and Aegon understood that whatever was happening in Arthur's face in that moment was not for anyone else to see. Then Arthur turned around. He did not offer it to Aegon. He buckled the scabbard to his own back, settled the weight of it with the small adjustment of a man putting on something he has worn 1,000 times, and stood. "This is mine to carry," Arthur said. "The weight of it is mine." Aegon nodded. Illyria looked at her brother for a long moment. Then she went to her knee. It was not a performative gesture, there was no sweep of the skirts, no bowing of the head, no theater to it. She simply went to her knee on the cold stone floor and stayed there. "House Dayne," she said, "keeps its oaths." She looked up at Aegon. "We do not march in the open. Not yet. But the roads we know, the names we hold, the eyes we have across Western Dorne, those are yours. Use them." "I will," Aegon said. She rose. She looked at Arthur one more time. "You still look terrible," she said. "It was a long 14 years, Arthur said. "I know," she said. "I counted them." She left them in the cold room with the torches and the empty table where dawn had been, and above them, through rock and stone and the deep indifference of the cliff, the summer sea moved against its base in the long rhythm it had maintained since before the Danes came, and would maintain long after all of them were gone. Arthur looked at the table, then at the door. "We leave at dawn," he said. The news came in pieces, the way bad news always comes, not as a single blow, but as a sequence of them, each one arriving before the bruise from the last had finished forming. First, Robert Baratheon was dead. A hunting accident. A boar. A hunting spear that snapped in the animal's hide at the wrong moment. A wound that went septic in the field before the maesters could do what maesters do. The king of the 7 kingdoms had died the way he had lived in his latter years, loudly, messily, and in a situation that a younger version of himself would have handled without difficulty. Second, Joffrey Baratheon sat the Iron Throne, first of his name. 12 years old, with his mother's eyes and none of her intelligence, and all of her capacity for cruelty, organized in a package that had been told, since birth, that the world existed to accommodate it. Third, Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Hand of the King, had been arrested on charges of treason. This last piece arrived 3 days after the first 2, carried by a rider Arthur had been expecting, a Dane household man who had been stationed in a village near the Prince's Pass for exactly this kind of contingency, a quiet man with a good memory who knew to ride hard and speak to no one else. He arrived at the camp they had made in the eastern foothills at the hour before dawn, and said what he had come to say and accepted water and left. Arthur read the letter twice. Then he held it over the campfire and watched it go. Aegon watched him read, watched him burn it. He had learned years ago not to ask Arthur what a letter said before Arthur was ready to say. The information always came. And it always came complete, and rushing it produced nothing except a slightly shorter silence. He waited. "Ned Stark is in the dungeons of the Red Keep," Arthur said. He was looking at the fire. "Accused of treason. The specific charge is claiming the throne rightfully belongs to Stannis Baratheon. The irony of that charge is considerable." Aegon said nothing. "They will move quickly," Arthur said. "The Lannisters do not leave enemies alive inside their own fortress if they can help it, and alive Ned Stark is a problem that compounds daily. He knows things. He has connections north and south. Every day he breathes in that dungeon is a day someone could reach him, or reach his family, or organize what is currently a scattered response into something coordinated." He looked up from the fire. "We have weeks. Perhaps less. What happens when they execute him?" Aegon said. "The North rises. Robb Stark calls his banners and marches south to avenge his father. He is 15 years old and by all account a capable commander, and he will spend the next 2 years winning every battle he fights and losing the war anyway, because wars are not decided by battles." He paused. "If we are not in position before the board locks into open conflict, we spend the next year untangling competing claims instead of consolidating a single one." Aegon looked at the mountains east of them, where the first gray was beginning to separate the ridgeline from the sky. "Dragonstone," he said. "Yes, Stannis, yes, you think he bends." Arthur was quiet for a moment. When he answered, it was carefully, which meant he had been turning the question over for longer than the pause suggested. Stannis Baratheon is the most legalistic mind in Westeros. He submitted to Robert's claim because Robert's claim was the established law of conquest, and Stannis bends to law the way other men bend to gravity, not because he has chosen to, but because he cannot conceive of the alternative. If the evidence of your claim is genuine and documented and presented without theater, then Stannis' own logic demands he yield to it. He picked up a stick and turned it in the fire. He will not like it. Stannis does not like most things, but he will do what the law requires. And if he doesn't, then we proceed without the Stormlands and take longer. Aegon stood up and began breaking the camp with the efficiency of someone who had broken camps in the dark many times, rolling the blankets, kicking dirt over the fire's edge, checking the horse's feet out of habit. Arthur watched him. "We should reach the coast in 4 days," Aegon said. 3 if we push the horses." 3, Arthur said. "We push." They found the Lannister riders on the afternoon of the second day, 6 of them, on a road that ran between 2 ridgelines through a gap that the locals called the Broken Tooth, a narrow pass not on any military map Arthur had seen, known primarily to herders and to people who moved through this part of the world with reasons to avoid the main roads. The Danes knew it. Apparently someone in the Lannister intelligence operation knew it too. Arthur saw them first. He put his hand out without turning, a flat palm, slow, the signal that meant stop and do not make it look like stopping. Aegon walked his horse around a shelf of rock and stood behind it and looked where Arthur was looking. 6 riders. Lannister crimson but worn over traveling clothes, without the polish of household knights on official business. A hedge knight at their lead, older, heavy-set, with a sword that had been re-hilted twice and an expression of professional boredom that went away the moment he raised his hand and stopped his own column. He had seen them. "They have a document case," Aegon said quietly. He had seen the leather satchel behind the lead rider's saddle. Not soldiers on patrol. They intercepted something. "From the Dane network," Arthur said. It was not a question. The rider who had come to them 3 days ago had been careful, but careful people made one mistake eventually, and one mistake on a road like this was enough. They may not know what they intercepted. They will know someone is moving through this pass who did not want to be found. If they reach a Lannister garrison, we lose weeks. Yes, and they carry whatever message that rider was sending before he reached us. Aegon looked at the riders. The hedge knight was still watching their position, hand up, his column halted. 6 men. The road narrows in 40 yards. If we go around, they follow. If we go back, they follow. He paused. We handle it here. Arthur looked at him. A beat passed. "I will take the lead rider and the 2 on the right flank." "No," Aegon said. "I will take the lead and the right. You cover the left and the rear." Silence, the horses shifted under them. Somewhere above the ridgeline a bird called once and did not call again. Arthur looked at his student for a long moment, not the long look of a man deciding whether to trust, but the look of a man who has already decided and is simply confirming that the decision holds. "Do not commit left," he said. "Your shoulder." "I know," Aegon said. They rode out from behind the shelf of rock at a walk. The hedge knight watched them come. His hand moved toward his sword and stopped there, the practiced non-aggression of a man who wanted to assess before he committed. Behind him, the 5 riders spread slightly, the automatic adjustment of soldiers recognizing a potential engagement. The hedge knight called out. Roads closed. Aegon did not stop walking his horse. He did not reach for his sword. He rode forward at the same pace, unhurried, and he watched the hedge knight's eyes, and the eyes of the 2 riders on the right flank, and the small signals that passed between them, the tightening of the knee against the horse's flank, the shift of weight that meant a decision had been made. He saw the hedge knight commit. What happened next took 40 seconds. Aegon had counted, afterward, and it was 40 seconds. He was certain of this not because he had been watching a clock, but because counting was a habit Arthur had built into him, the understanding that time in a fight was a resource with a known quantity, and you spent it like any other resource, deliberately and without waste. He closed the distance on the hedge knight before the man's sword was fully drawn. His blade came across at the angle Arthur had drilled into him for years, not down, not horizontal, the diagonal that the body cannot instinctively defend against, because it does not appear in practice sparring. Because practice sparring is about patterns, and this was not a pattern. The hedge knight went down. The two riders on the right flank were good. The closer one landed a cut along Aegon's left forearm that drew blood before Aegon adjusted and put him in the ground. The second one wheeled his horse, and that was a mistake, because a wheeling horse is briefly committed in one direction, and Aegon was already moving to cut that direction off. On the left and the rear, Arthur was unhurried. He did not need to hurry. It was 40 seconds. Aegon sat on his horse in the silence after and looked at the 6 men on the ground and felt the cut on his forearm, which was bleeding cleanly through his sleeve in a way that meant it was deep enough to need binding but not deep enough to need concern. He did not feel the things he had heard men describe, the shaking, the overwhelming reality of what had just happened landing on them like something physical. He felt his own breathing, which was elevated. He felt the horse moving beneath him, unsettled by the smell. He felt the wind in the gap. He felt calm. This was the thing he could not have known until now, that the years of training had built not just technique, but temperature. That the regulated burn Arthur had spent years building in him stayed regulated when it was needed. He had not known that until this moment, and now he knew it, and he filed it. Arthur rode up beside him. He looked at the cut on Aegon's arm. He reached into his saddlebag for cloth without being asked, and handed it across. "Your shoulder held," Arthur said. "Yes," Aegon said. He tied the cloth around his forearm with his teeth and his right hand. Arthur retrieved the leather satchel from behind the dead hedge knight's saddle. He opened it. Read the contents. His expression told Aegon nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "It is from one of ours," Arthur said. "A contact in Sunspear. Reporting our presence in the pass." He folded it, put it in his own saddlebag. "Someone in the Dane network sold us. Does it matter right now?" Aegon said. "No," Arthur said. "It matters later." He looked at the road ahead, where it descended out of the mountains toward the coast. "We push harder than 3 days." He rode. Aegon fell in beside him. The road descended. The smell of the sea was somewhere ahead of them, past the ridge lines, past the foothills, past whatever else the road intended to put between them and a boat. Aegon did not look back. Dragonstone smelled of sulfur and salt, and the particular dampness of stone that has never fully dried in living memory. The island breathed it, pulled the smell up from the volcanic rock below, and pushed it through every corridor and hall. So that after 3 days a visitor stopped noticing it, and after 3 weeks it became the smell of the air itself, indistinguishable from breathing. Stannis Baratheon had lived here for years. He had long since stopped noticing it. He was at the painted table when they announced the visitors. He did not look up immediately. He was studying the riverlands, specifically the ford configurations along the Trident, where Robb Stark's banners would eventually have to cross if they marched south, and where a coordinated Stormlands force could theoretically apply pressure to the flank if the timing was precise, and if Stannis had the men to spare, which currently he did not. He had the fleet. He did not have enough men. He had been thinking about this problem for 3 days. "My lord," Sir Davos said. The old smuggler's voice carried its usual quality of careful neutrality, the tone of a man who has learned to present information without inserting himself into the reaction to it. "The visitors at the dock. They are asking for you personally. They decline to give names." "Then tell them to leave," Stannis said. He did not look up. "One of them," Davos said, "is carrying a blade I have only ever seen described." Stannis looked up. He came to the hall himself rather than sending a guard, which told Davos something, though Davos was careful about what conclusions he drew from things Stannis did not explain. The hall was small by mainland standards. Dragonstone had been built for function rather than impression. By Valyrian engineers who understood that the point of a fortress was the fortress, not the theater of the fortress. The walls were black stone carved into the shapes of dragons so thoroughly that the architecture and the ornamentation had become the same thing. Gargoyles at every corner. The fire in the hearth burned too hot because the stone around it conducted something from the rock below. Aegon and Arthur waited in the center of the hall. They had not been asked to wait there. They had simply placed themselves there, Arthur 2 steps behind and to the left, the position that was simultaneously bodyguard and announcer. the position that put Dawn visible to anyone who entered the room from the main door. Aegon stood with his hands at his sides and his back straight, and said nothing. He had been waiting for 4 minutes, and he looked like a man who could wait for 4 hours in the same posture. Stannis came through the door. He stopped. He looked at Arthur Dayne. He looked at the sword. He looked at Arthur's face, which was the face of a man who had been dead for 15 years, and looked at, older than the stories, harder than the paintings. With a beard no one had described in any account Stannis had read, because the accounts all ended in 283 ac. Stannis gripped the table beside him. It was the only thing he did. "You're dead," Stannis said. "So I was told," Arthur said. Silence. Stannis let go of the table. He walked into the room, and he looked at Aegon, and he looked at Aegon the way he looked at the painted table, not with awe, not with emotion, but with the assessing focus of a man who is running calculations and will not stop until they resolve. "Who are you?" Stannis said. It was not quite a question. "You know who I am," Aegon said. "You ran the logic the moment you saw him." Another silence. Stannis pulled a chair from the table, turned it to face them, and sat in it. He did not offer them chairs. He did not call for wine. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at Aegon with the grinding intensity of a man who had spent his life refusing to be wrong about anything and was currently deciding whether he was about to be wrong about everything. "State it," Stannis said. "All of it, from the beginning." Aegon stated it. He spoke for 20 minutes without notes, because Arthur had made him rehearse it without notes, had drilled into him the understanding that a man who needs to read his own claim is a man who does not yet own his claim. He laid out the marriage first, the septon, the location, the witnesses who were alive, and the documentation that survived the ones who were not. He laid out the timeline, Tower of Joy, the infant, Ned Stark riding north with a child he called his bastard, 14 years of deliberate silence. He laid out the succession law and the specific ranking of claimants, precisely, without editorial. The way you lay out a mathematical proof where the conclusion is not an argument, but an outcome. He finished. He waited. Stannis said, "Ned Stark's word is not evidence. The word of a man who had reason to lie is not evidence. Then consider what you have before you," Aegon said. "Arthur Dayne, dead these 15 years, stands here alive. He carries the sword that only a Dane may carry, and you know what that sword looks like because you have read every account of the Tower of Joy that exists. The only explanation for his survival that requires fewer assumptions than any alternative is this: he was with my mother when she died. He took me from her arms. He has spent my entire life making me capable of claiming what is mine." He paused. "You are a man who follows evidence where it leads, my lord. Follow it." Stannis's jaw moved. Not speaking, grinding, the thing his jaw did when he was processing something that offended him structurally, even as he recognized its validity. Davos, standing to the side, recognized the motion and said nothing. "Viserys Targaryen," Stannis said. "My uncle believes he holds a superior claim," Aegon said. "He is wrong. Rhaegar's children inherit before Aerys's younger sons under Targaryen succession law. Viserys is not my predecessor. He is my uncle. Viserys is in Essos. Yes, and his sister is about to be sold to a Dothraki warlord. Yes." Stannis stood up. He walked to the window that faced the sea, the black water between Dragonstone and the mainland, which was just visible as a gray line on the horizon when the weather permitted. He stood there, with his hands clasped behind his back, which was the posture of a man who had already made his decision and was reviewing it for errors before announcing it. "I claimed this throne," Stannis said, "because Joffrey is a bastard, and the law demands the crown pass to the legitimate heir. That is not ambition. That is arithmetic." He did not turn around. "If your claim is genuine, my claim does not exist. It never existed. I am Robert's younger brother, and Robert's line is finished with or without the incest, because Robert had no legitimate heirs, and I cannot claim through an illegitimate line." He paused. "The logic is not complicated." "No," Aegon said. "It is not." "What I do not accept," Stannis said, turning, "is your timeline. You expect me to abandon my own claim, the fleet I have built, the men I have spent 2 years persuading, on the basis of one man's testimony and documents I have not examined." "Then examine them," Aegon said. He looked at Arthur, who crossed the room and placed the locked box on the painted table. The same box from the keep in the mountains, carried inside Arthur's saddlebag from the Red Mountains to the Torrentine, to the coast, to the boat to this island. The marriage documentation. The Septon's record, or a certified copy of it retrieved from the sept above the green blood. A letter in Rhaegar Targaryen's own hand, which your maesters can verify against other documents from his reign. He paused. "Take 3 days. Examine everything. And when you have finished, tell me what the arithmetic says." Stannis looked at the box. He looked at Aegon. "You are 15 years old," Stannis said. "Yes, you speak like someone considerably older." "I had a specific education," Aegon said. Stannis looked at Arthur. Something passed across his face that was not quite the thing it would have been in another man, not admiration, because Stannis did not deal in admiration. Something closer to the recognition one precise instrument has for another. "You trained him to make this argument." "I trained him for everything," Arthur said. "The argument is his." Stannis was quiet for a long moment. He went back to the painted table and stood at its edge, looking down at the carved geography of Westeros beneath his hands. He found the location of Dragonstone on the carved surface, the small island in the painted sea, and he looked at it the way he looked at everything that touched his pride, without flinching and without yielding to the feeling. Simply registering it and moving past it to the thing that mattered. Then he went to his knee. It was not a ceremony. There was no grandeur to it, no bowing of the head, no sweep of the hand, no performance of deference from a man who had never performed anything in his life. He went to his knee on the stone floor of Dragonstone's hall the way he did everything, because the logic required it. And Stannis Baratheon did what logic required. The stone under his knee was cold and hard, and he did not appear to notice. "If the documents confirm what you have told me," Stannis said, his eyes level with Aegon's, "then I am your man. Not because I choose to be. Because the law says I am." He paused. "I want the right to examine everything. Every document. Every letter. I want a maester's verification on the handwriting, and I want Howland Reed's written testimony, because he is the only living witness besides yourself, and a man who claims to be dead." "You will have all of it," Aegon said. "Then we have an agreement." Stannis stood. He did not offer his hand. That was not how Stannis made things real. Things became real through their logic, not through their theater. He looked at Davos, who was still standing at the side of the room with the expression of a man watching history move through a space he happened to be occupying. "Have the east wing prepared. They stay until I am satisfied." "Aye, my lord," Davos said. Stannis walked toward the door. At the threshold he stopped. He did not turn around. "Sir Arthur," he said. "My lord," Arthur said. "The King's Guard that remained at the Tower of Joy," Stannis said. "Gerald Hightower. Oswell went. They died protecting the heir. Yes, then they died in the execution of their oath." A pause. "That is more than most men can say." He left. The fire in the hearth burned too hot. The sulfur smell moved through the room. Davos looked at Aegon, and then at Arthur, and then back at Aegon, with the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. 3 days, Aegon said quietly. He looked at the painted table, at the carved riverlands, the carved north, the carved capital at the center of it all. At the geography of a kingdom that was currently tearing itself apart over a throne it did not know had a rightful claimant. "Tell me about his fleet." Davos blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "His fleet," Aegon said. "Numbers, condition. Where it is currently staged." He looked up. "We have 3 days. I would like to use them." The lake did not care about the battle. It sat to the east of the road in the gray morning light, flat and enormous and indifferent, its surface moving in the small increments of deep water, responding to distant wind. The God's Eye was the largest lake in Westeros, and it held an island at its center that no one went to and everyone knew about, and the trees along its shoreline were old enough that their roots had broken the road in places, and it was these broken places, the roots, the soft ground between them, the way the road narrowed to barely 2 horses wide before the tree line pushed back, that Aegon had looked at the evening before and said, "Here." Here was where they would stand. The Northern and Riverlands infantry held the road itself, shield wall 3 ranks deep, anchored on the lakeside by the shoreline, and on the west, by a stand of old oak that cavalry could not penetrate at speed. The flanking cavalry, lighter horses, mixed Northern and Tully. Riders who had grown up on terrain like this and knew how the ground changed under hooves when the soil held water, was positioned in the trees to the west, invisible, waiting. Aegon sat his horse at the rear of the infantry line and watched the Lannister column come up the road from the south. They came fast. Jaime Lannister's tactical signature had always been speed. The Lannister vanguard moved with the disciplined aggression of a man who understood that the first army to arrive at a crisis point with force intact controlled the terms of engagement. 600 heavy horse, armored, their crimson cloaks gone under riding gear for the march. Infantry behind them, 2,000, quick-moving. Jaime at the front, because Jaime was always at the front, which was either courage or arrogance, depending on whether he won. Aegon watched the column approach the narrowing and felt the specific quality of calm that Arthur had spent years building in him, not the calm of a man who was not afraid, but the calm of a man who had learned to put fear in its proper place, which was behind the calculations and not in front of them. "Hold," Aegon said. Quietly, the rider beside him relayed it down the line in a tone pitched to carry to the officers and not beyond. The Lannister cavalry hit the narrowing at a canter and compressed. The road did not accommodate 600 heavy horses riding 4 abreast. It accommodated 2, then 1.5. Then the horses were shouldering each other and the riders were pulling at reins, and the column's momentum, which had been its advantage, became its problem. The front ranks slowed, the rear ranks compressed into them. Aegon waited another 15 seconds. "Flanks," he said. Jaime Lannister heard the cavalry come out of the trees on his left before he saw it. The sound of it, hooves on soft ground, a different register than the road, a sound that his body recognized as threat before his mind had processed the direction, made him pull his horse hard right and draw his sword in the same motion. The two things happening simultaneously the way they do in a man who has spent enough years with a blade that the blade and the body are the same system. The flank cavalry hit the compressed column at the point where the horses were most tightly packed and the riders had the least room to respond. Not a charge in the conventional sense, there was no room for a full charge, but a pressure, an insertion, riders driving into the gaps between Lannister horses and using their lighter weight, and the element of surprise to create the specific chaos that heavy cavalry cannot function in, which is close quarters where the armor is more weight than protection. The Lannister column broke in the middle and held at the front. Jaime held at the front, held it personally, his horse wheeling under him with the controlled aggression of a destrier that had been trained for exactly this, his sword moving in the short, efficient arcs that worked when there was no room for full swings. He was extraordinary in a press. Barristan had said it once, said it privately to a man he trusted. Jaime Lannister in a melee was the most dangerous thing he had ever been adjacent to. Not because of technique, though the technique was superb, but because of the speed at which he processed, the reaction time that made other fighters seem, to him, like they were moving through water. He processed the situation in the time it took his horse to complete a full turn. Column broken. Flank compromised. Rear engaged by infantry coming up the road. The high ground, such as it was, a slight rise in the road 50 yards north, already occupied by the enemy's reserve cavalry. He looked for Arthur. He found him the way you find a still point in a storm. Not because Arthur was stationary, he was moving, working through the edge of the engagement with the unhurried precision of a man who has identified the sequence and is proceeding through it, but because the quality of his movement was different from everything around him. Everything around him was reaction. Arthur was intention. Jaime drove his horse through the gap between 2 of his own infantry and closed the distance. Arthur turned before Jaime reached him. He turned the way he always turned, completely, unhurried, the full commitment of a man who does not need the warning that reaction time provides, because he has already anticipated the need for it. He looked at Jaime across the 10 feet of churned ground between them. "You trained me," Jaime said. "I did," Arthur said. "Then you know I'm good enough to make this interesting." "Yes," Arthur said. and he drew dawn. They fought for 11 minutes. Aegon counted. He had positioned himself where he could see both the engagement and the duel, and he counted because Arthur had built the habit into him, and because counting was the only thing that kept him from doing what every instinct he had was demanding, which was to cross the field and put himself between the two men, which would have been tactically disastrous and personally ruinous, and exactly the kind of decision that emotion produced and discipline prevented. He watched and he counted. Jaime was extraordinary. This was the thing Aegon had to hold steady in his mind, not as a comfort or a threat, but simply as a fact that needed to be accurately assessed. The 15 years since his training had not been idle years. Jaime Lannister had spent them sharpening himself against every worthy opponent the Seven Kingdoms could produce, and the thing that Arthur had built in him was still there, still the foundation, but it had been developed in directions Arthur had not directed, and in ways that made him genuinely unpredictable in the first exchanges. He landed a cut along Arthur's ribs in the 3rd minute. Not deep, Arthur moved at the last moment with the adjustment of a man who had accepted a cost to avoid a larger one, but blood came, and Jaime saw it, and something changed in Jaime's attack, in the way things change when a man believes he has found the line. He had not found the line. In the 6th minute, Jaime drove a combination that forced Arthur to his knee. One knee, briefly, the right one, on the soft ground at the road's edge. Jaime came in immediately, the correct response, the only response, the response his training demanded, and Arthur was no longer there. He had moved off the line in the fraction of a second that Jaime's momentum committed, and Jaime's sword took the empty air where Arthur had been, and Arthur was behind him. Jaime recovered. Turned, he was breathing hard now. His footwork adjusted, he widened his stance slightly, dropping his center of gravity, which was what he did when he recognized he was being outpaced. Arthur saw it. He had seen it before. He had built the habit himself, 15 years ago, in a training yard in the Targaryen court, drilling a young man who over-rotated on the backswing when he was pressed from a wide stance, whose left shoulder dipped fractionally before each committed strike, who was brilliant and fast and almost impossible to read, and who had one sequence that he fell into under pressure the way all men fall into. The thing they trust most. Arthur waited for the pressure to build. In the 9th minute, Jaime came with everything, the full committed combination that ended every fight he won, the sequence that had put 100 trained men on the ground. The first strike was perfect, the second was perfect, the third had the over-rotation, the dipping shoulder, the fractional opening that lasted less than a heartbeat. Arthur closed the line. Dawn hit Jaime's blade at the weak point, the third of the blade closest to the tip, where the leverage was thinnest, and the force of it went through the steel and into Jaime's wrist, and the sword left his hand and was on the ground, and Dawn was at Jaime's throat, and Jaime was on his knees in the mud of the God's Eye Road. He was bleeding from 3 places. His breathing was controlled, which cost him something. He looked at the pale blade an inch from his throat, and then up at Arthur, and his face did the thing it did when Jaime Lannister was in the process of reassessing something fundamental about the world. "You're supposed to be dead," Jaime said. "I was hiding," Arthur said. "Now I'm not." A silence. The battle was still moving around them, the sounds of it, the specific sounds of a fight in its later stages, where the outcome has been decided, and the remaining noise is the resolution, the surrender, the winding down of violence, back to whatever comes after. "Yield," Arthur said. Jaime looked at the blade, looked at the ground beside him where his sword lay, looked at the tree line where the last of the Lannister cavalry was dissolving into individual riders, making individual decisions about whether to fight or run. He had always been good at mathematics. Mathematics was the thing that survived pride and anger and the specific grief of losing, the thing that remained after everything else was spent. "I yield," Jaime said. Arthur lowered Dawn. Step back. Jaime stayed where he was for a moment, on his knees in the mud, and then he stood, and he did it without help, because Jaime Lannister would do that until he was physically incapable of it. He looked at Arthur for a long moment. 15 years, he said. You spent 15 years hiding. Yes, for him. Not a question. Jaime had already triangulated. Yes, Jaime said nothing else. He bent, picked up his sword, reversed it, and held it out hilt first. The formal surrender of a knight. Old habit, older than politics. Arthur took it. On the other side of the field, Aegon was riding back through the aftermath. The Lannister cavalry flank had broken in the 7th minute and routed in the 9th and was finished. The riders scattered into the tree line on the western side of the road, with no coherent formation remaining. The infantry behind them had halted when the cavalry broke, 2,000 men who looked at what had happened ahead of them and made the calculation that their general had made in the mud beside the lake. Aegon rode through the stopped infantry columns slowly. He said nothing to them. He was looking at the ground, at the wounded on both sides, the Lannister men in their crimson, the Riverlands men in their house colors, all of them in the same mud with the same expressions. He found the officer in command of the Lannister infantry, a steady man, older, with a scar across his jaw, and the careful eyes of someone who had survived enough to know what survival required. "You're wounded," Aegon said to him. "My maesters will tend them alongside ours." The officer looked at him. He was trying to determine something, what kind of man gave that order in that moment, what it meant about what came next. "You have my word," Aegon said. "No Lannister soldier who yields is harmed. That is not a courtesy, it is a standing rule." The officer said, "And the Kingslayer?" "Lord Jaime is my prisoner," Aegon said. "He will be treated accordingly." He rode on through the stopped column, and behind him the Lannister officer said something quietly to the men nearest him, and the men relayed it, and the sound of it moving down the column, not words, just the particular quality of tension releasing, of men putting down the specific weight of imminent death, was the sound of the mathematics resolving. Aegon found Arthur waiting at the road's northern end, with Jaime standing 3 feet away, and he looked at his teacher and at the man his teacher had made, and at the sword in Arthur's hand that had ended the question, and he did not let the relief reach his face, because relief was something you felt when you believed the worst possibility was behind you. And Aegon was 15 years old, and had been educated well enough to know that it was not. The city smelled of fear before they reached the walls. It was not a metaphor. Fear had a specific chemistry. It moved through a population the way weather moved through a valley, changing the air, changing the quality of sound, changing the way smoke rose from cook fires, and the way dogs behaved on their chains. Aegon had been taught this by Arthur, who had learned it in the field, and he recognized it now as they came up the King's Road with the army behind them and King's Landing resolved from a smudge on the horizon into the actual thing, which was the largest city in Westeros, and which was, at this precise moment, performing the specific body language of a place that had already decided something was over and was waiting for the formal confirmation. The gates were closed. That was expected. Beyond that, the signs accumulated. No smoke from the Gold Cloak barracks on the northern wall, the fires banked low, men conserving heat rather than maintaining presence. The merchant district immediately outside the walls had been emptied out, the stalls stripped, the animals moved. The particular cleanliness of an area that had been picked over by people who were not planning to return soon. The harbor, visible from the hill above the approach road, held fewer ships than it should. The ones that remained were riding high, either emptied of cargo or carrying cargo away from the city rather than toward it. Aegon looked at all of this and said nothing. Arthur rode beside him and also said nothing, because it did not require comment. The city was telling them what it intended to do, and the city intended to survive. The offer came at noon. A rider under a white flag, not a Kingsguard, not a household knight, a middle-aged Lannister retainer, with the face of a man executing instructions he had not been consulted about. He rode to within 50 yards of the Targaryen advance line and stopped and waited, and Aegon rode out to meet him with Arthur 3 paces behind. The retainer did not dismount. He said, "The Queen Regent offers terms for the resolution of this matter without further violence." He said it with the careful neutrality of a man reading from a document he had memorized, which he probably was. Lord Aegon is to withdraw his forces from the King's Road and the harbor approach. The Queen Regent will allow a delegation of 3, no more, to enter the Red Keep for negotiations regarding. "No," Aegon said. The retainer stopped. "Those are not terms," Aegon said. "Those are a delay. The Queen Regent wants time to move assets, burn evidence, and negotiate with Dragonstone simultaneously. Which Stannis will not agree to, because Stannis does not negotiate with people who are in the process of lying to him." He looked at the man steadily. "Take her a different message. From me, not a delegation, not a letter. Tell her this exactly." He told him. The retainer's expression did not change, because the expression of a man reading from a memorized document is already fixed in the position of a man not reacting to anything. But something behind his eyes registered what he was hearing, and filed it in the place where things go that you will think about later, when you have put sufficient distance between yourself and the moment. He turned his horse and rode back to the gate. Arthur said, when he was gone, "She will not accept." "No," Aegon said, "but she will spend the next 6 hours deciding whether to accept, and while she is deciding, her garrison is watching her decide, and a garrison watching its commander try to determine whether a war is over is a garrison that is already making private calculations." Arthur looked at him sidelong. "You learned that from Ned. I learned that from you teaching me what Ned did during the rebellion." He looked at the walls. He held Moat Cailin for 3 days without a fight by letting the Lannister garrison see him being patient. Cersei Lannister had been awake for 31 hours. This was not visible. The thing she had always been able to do, the thing that was genuine, not performance, the specific capacity that had made her formidable in a court full of men who underestimated what they were looking at, was to maintain the outward architecture of composure while everything inside it was being recalculated at speed. She sat in the small council chamber alone and looked at the map on the table. And she thought. Beneath the city, in the tunnels and cellars that ran under the streets of King's Landing, sat the wildfire. Not new caches, these had been buried here for years, laid down under the Mad King Aerys's instruction in the final desperate months of his reign, placed by the Alchemists' Guild at his command, enough of the substance to burn the city to ash if the right jars were opened in the right places. Aerys had told no one the full scope of it. Jaime had known, because Aerys had told Jaime in the last hours, cackling, inviting the Kingsguard to watch the city burn rather than let Robert have it. Jaime had put a sword through his back before he could give the order, but the caches remained. Cersei had learned of them through the alchemists, Wisdom Halland specifically. A small nervous man who served whoever sat the throne, and had decided, with reasonable accuracy, that Cersei was currently that person. He had come to her 3 weeks ago with the specificity of a man unburdening himself of a dangerous secret, and she had listened, and she had not yet decided. She was deciding now. She could use it. The calculation was not the same as it had been 3 hours ago, before the retainer returned with Aegon's terms. She had been told she could leave the Red Keep with her children. She had been told her life was not in question. The terms were generous enough to be insulting, which meant they were strategy rather than mercy. He was removing the calculation from her hands by offering her what she needed before she could threaten to burn it. She understood the move. She had taught Joffrey to play Saivas, and had never managed to explain to him that the game was won by reading the board, not by wanting to win. She was looking at the board now. The wildfire would burn the city. It would kill the small folk who were already quietly helping his army through the back gates. It would invoke Aerys in every account that was ever written about this day, would make her the Mad Queen, where Aerys had been the Mad King, would hand Aegon Targaryen a martyrdom more powerful than any military victory. And Jaime was in his camp. She sat with that last fact for a long moment. It was the fact that everything else organized itself around, as facts sometimes did, the fixed point that told you what the rest of the map was. She stood. Called the household guard. "Tell Wisdom Halland his services are concluded," she said. "He is to return the access points to sealed status and present himself to the garrison commander for escort from the city." She looked at the map one more time. "And have my trunks brought up." 2 of them. Joffrey learned what was happening when the gate commander sent a page to tell him, because the gate commander had correctly identified that the king needed to know his gate was about to open, and had incorrectly assumed this information would produce a useful response. He came to the walls himself. He had his crossbow. He stood on the battlements above the main gate and looked at the army arranged across the road below him, and at the silver Targaryen banner moving in the morning wind, and at the white cloak visible in the command position, and he felt, for the first time in his 12 years of life, the specific sensation of a world refusing to organize itself around him. He raised the crossbow. One of the gold cloaks put a hand on his arm, gently, carefully, the touch of a man who understood that this was a gesture he was making, rather than a plan he had, and said, quietly, that a crossbow bolt from the walls would not change the outcome and would complicate the terms. Joffrey looked at the man. He looked at the crossbow. He looked at the army. He went back inside. The gate commander opened the gates an hour later. He did it himself, personally, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had made a decision based on mathematics and had decided that the record should reflect he had made it without being coerced. The great hinges moved. The bar came up. The gates swung inward. Aegon rode in at a walk. He had decided the pace before they reached the walls, and he maintained it through the gate and into the city, because a king who rides fast into a city he has just been given is a king performing victory, and performance was the thing Arthur had spent 14 years training out of him. He rode at the pace of a man who was going somewhere he was supposed to go. The streets were not empty. The small folk of King's Landing had a complicated relationship with spectacle. They had seen the sack, had lived through Robert's reign, had watched the city lurch from crisis to crisis with the resigned pragmatism of people who had learned that surviving a change of power required being visible enough to demonstrate non-threat and invisible enough to avoid becoming collateral. They stood at the sides of the streets and they watched. Aegon looked at them as he rode, not at the faces particularly, at the aggregate, at the crowd's body language, at the specific quality of what a population did when it was trying to determine whether the man riding through it was the kind of thing that would hurt them. He had been taught to read this. He read it now. What he saw was not welcome, and it was not hostility. It was assessment. They were doing the same thing he was doing, which was looking at the situation and deciding what it was. He gave them nothing to fear. He gave them nothing to celebrate. He rode through their city at a walk, and he looked at it the way a man looked at something he intended to understand before he attempted to change it. The Red Keep gates were open. The garrison had stood down before he reached them, not fled, not surrendered in the formal sense, simply stood aside, the decision made in the collective body language of men who had identified the moment when the thing they were guarding was no longer what they had agreed to guard. Aegon dismounted in the outer ward. He walked through the Red Keep's gate on foot. He did not look up at the old dragon skulls stored in the cellars below. He did not stop at the Iron Throne Room as he passed its doors. He would sit in that room, in that chair. But not today. Today the building was still a building full of people deciding what they were, and walking through it was not a ceremony. It was a survey. He found the small council chamber. He sat at the table. He waited. Jaime Lannister was brought before him that evening. He stood in the small council chamber without chains. Aegon had given that instruction specifically, because a man in chains in front of a king is performing submission, and Aegon wanted to see what Jaime did without the performance. He stood in the clothes he had been given after the battle, which were clean and plain and northern, and he looked at Aegon across the table with the particular quality of attention that Jaime Lannister gave to things that had genuinely surprised him. He was quiet for a long time. Then, "You're 15, Jaime said. "Yes," Aegon said. "Arthur made you in 15 years. Not a question." A statement that was working through its own implications. "He made me in 14, Aegon said. "The 15th year was for this." Jaime looked at the table, at the map on it, at the positions marked in grease pencil, where the army stood, where the fleet was, where the Lannister forces that had not yet surrendered were being held. He read the map the way a military man read maps, which was quickly and completely. He said nothing for a moment. "The Night's Watch," Aegon said. Jaime looked up. "Lord Eddard proposed it before he was arrested. He believed you deserved the chance to answer for the things you've done, the Kingsguard oath, the children, the deception, in service rather than in death." Aegon held his gaze. He also believed that what you did when Aerys intended to burn the city was not something the realm had ever properly reckoned with. The record calls you Kingslayer. The record is incomplete. A pause. I intend to correct it." Jaime said nothing. His face was doing something that was not quite the expression he wore when he was calculating, and not quite the expression he wore when he felt something. It was the expression in between, which was rarer than either. "The black," Jaime said finally. Yes, he looked at the map again. At the army outside. At the small council chamber of the Red Keep, where he had spent 15 years walking in and out with a sword at his hip and a crown to protect. He thought about Cersei, who was somewhere in this building packing 2 trunks, and he thought about Joffrey, who was somewhere in this building learning what it felt like to stop being a king. And he thought about the things he had done to protect all of it. "All right," Jaime said. Not resignation, not performance, the flat, clean sound of a man who had looked at the mathematics and found, at the end of it, something he could stand under. He left. The Iron Throne was ugly. Aegon stood before it in the throne room of the Red Keep, and looked at it with the assessing focus of a man who has been told about a thing his entire life, and is now determining the accuracy of the description. It was larger than he had imagined, not taller. The height was close to what he had built from Arthur's account, but wider, more sprawling, with the particular asymmetry of something that had been assembled rather than designed. 1,000 swords. Aegon the Conqueror's dragons had melted them, and his smiths had shaped the result into something that could be sat on, technically, if you were careful. If you knew where the edges were, if you understood that the throne had been built the way it had been built, deliberately. To make the point that ruling was not comfort, that the seat of power in the 7 kingdoms was a thing forged from the weapons of enemies, and that anyone who forgot that was already making the mistake that would kill them. He had been told this by Arthur when he was 9 years old, sitting in the dirt of the courtyard in the Red Mountains while Arthur drew maps. He had remembered it. He walked up the steps to the throne and stood before it for a long moment and looked at it the way he looked at everything that mattered, not with awe, not with hunger, with the cold accuracy of a man who needed to know exactly what something was before he decided what to do with it. Then he sat. The iron was cold through the leather of his riding clothes. One of the blades at the arm's edge was positioned at an angle that would cut the hand of anyone who gripped it without knowing where to place their fingers. He placed his fingers correctly. He looked at the throne room. It was empty, which was how he had wanted it. The lords would come later. The ceremonies would happen in their proper sequence. The business of transition would grind through its necessary stages. But this moment, the first time he sat, was not a performance. It was a private acknowledgement between himself and the thing he was sitting on, an understanding reached without witnesses about what this meant and what it did not mean, and what it would require. He sat for 7 minutes. Then he stood, walked back down the steps, and went to find Arthur. The coronation was held in the throne room the following morning. The High Septon performed it. He was a pragmatic man, which was the primary qualification Aegon had looked for in a High Septon, a man who understood that the faith's relationship to the crown was a long relationship, that long relationships required accommodation, and that accommodating a legitimate king who had taken his capital without burning it was the kind of accommodation that did not require extensive theological justification. The lords assembled. The oaths were sworn. The anointing happened with the oil, and the words that had been used for Targaryen kings since Aegon the Conqueror had decided that the new dynasty required the blessing of an institution that predated it. When it was done, when the lords had spoken their words and the septon had spoken his and the crown, a simple thing, plain gold, found in the treasury, had been placed and removed by Aegon himself because Arthur had told him that a king who needed help putting on his own crown had already communicated something he did not intend to communicate. Aegon stood from the throne and looked at the assembled room. "Ser Arthur," he said. Arthur stepped forward from the position he had held throughout the ceremony, which was the position he had held for 15 years, close, attentive, the controlled stillness of a man who was always ready and never performing readiness. He wore the white cloak. He had worn it every day since Harrenhal, because the white cloak in this room was not a personal statement. It was a signal to every lord in every house about what the Kingsguard was, and what it meant, and what it would be from this point forward. "Kneel," Aegon said. Arthur went to his knee. "I name you Lord Commander of the Kingsguard," Aegon said. "For the second time in your life, and the last, and I ask you to hold the position until you cannot hold it, which I expect will be considerably longer than either of us can currently calculate." He paused. "Rise." Arthur rose. He did not bow his head. He looked at Aegon with those eyes, the same eyes that had looked at a boy of 5 holding a wooden sword in a Dornish courtyard, and found something in the Gripworth building, and for a moment something moved through them that was not the trained calm of 15 years of necessity, but the thing underneath it, the thing Arthur Dayne had kept below the surface for the entirety of the time Aegon had known him, which had been the entirety of Aegon's life. It was brief, then it was gone, then Arthur was himself again, which was the version of himself the room could see. The lords in the assembled hall seemed to breathe differently after. Something had been confirmed that they had needed confirmed. The pardons came in the afternoon. Aegon received the lords in the small council chamber with Davos Seaworth standing at the door. He had given Davos the position of hand, because the realm needed a hand who had no inherited loyalties to any of the great houses, and who had spent his life developing the specific skill set of a man who accomplished things without drawing attention. And also because Stannis had endorsed the appointment with the particular flavor of endorsement that meant Stannis could not find a legal objection, which was the closest Stannis came to enthusiasm. The northern lords were received first. They had bent the knee to Robert under the constraint of conquest, had followed their lord paramount to war against an illegitimate claim, and had done so with the discipline and loyalty that the North had always expressed its values through. They were pardoned fully, in language that made the logic explicit, because Aegon had decided that the language of the pardons was as important as the pardons themselves. Every word of every decree would be read and reread by men trying to understand what kind of king they were dealing with. And every word needed to be accurate. The Riverlords and Stormland's bannermen who had joined early received grants, land adjustments, minor offices, the small material acknowledgments that transformed political decisions into durable loyalty. Nothing excessive, nothing that created a class of crown-dependent lords who would become a different kind of problem in 10 years. Enough to make the mathematics of having chosen correctly feel correct. Cersei was addressed last, in the document, not in person. She had left the Red Keep that morning with her children and 2 trunks, and the specific expression of a woman storing everything she felt for a future accounting that she was absolutely certain she would make. Aegon had not watched her leave. There was nothing to be gained from watching, and something to be lost in the quality of what it might produce in him if he watched, and he was careful about what he allowed to produce things in him. The document stripping her of title and wealth was precise, legally complete, and contained no language of condemnation beyond what the facts required. Joffrey was declared a bastard in a separate document, brief, factual, referencing the genetic evidence and the testimony of 3 independent witnesses, and the document included his dispatch to the Sept of Baelor with instructions for the taking of vows. The elder brother there was a man of genuine conviction who would know what to do with a 12-year-old of destructive temperament and no remaining options. Tommen and Myrcella were not mentioned in any public decree. They were children. What happened to them was a private arrangement, made through Davos, involving a sept in the hills east of Casterly Rock and a septa of considerable patience and genuine kindness. They would be educated. They would be safe. What they would be permitted to become in 20 years was a question for 20 years from now. Tywin Lannister's summons was issued at dusk. It was written in the specific language of a summons rather than an arrest warrant, because the distinction mattered legally, and Aegon was not ready to collapse the distinction into the same document. Tywin was 3 weeks away. The summons was the opening move, and Tywin would understand it as such, and Aegon understood that Tywin would understand it, and Tywin would understand that Aegon understood, and the entire first exchange between them was already being conducted at this remove, through the vocabulary of a written command, with all the implications left correctly implied. The list was released at the same hour. It was a single page. It contained 41 names. Below each name was a date, the date of a death, or a crime, or a silence that had functioned as complicity. Some of the men on the list were dead already. Some were old. Some were sitting in their halls at this precise moment, reading copies of the list that Aegon's riders were carrying to every major seat in the realm simultaneously, and finding their own names on it, and understanding that the new king had a specific and comprehensive memory. The list contained no death sentences, no demands, no instructions of any kind. It was a record. It was a public record, issued with the crown's seal, which meant it was now a permanent document of the realm. What Aegon intended to do with each name was not stated. The not stating was the point. Men who deserved to spend the rest of their lives wondering what was coming had, for the first time in 15 years, cause to spend them that way. The Raven arrived as the city was going to sleep. Aegon was at the writing table in the small council chamber, working through a stack of correspondence that had accumulated during the days of transition. The ravens that had come in from every corner of the realm since the gates opened, the lords and masters and septons and merchants who needed to know what the new order meant for the specific thing they cared about. He was reading them in the order Davos had organized them, which was the order of consequence rather than urgency. Which was a distinction Davos had explained on the first morning, and that Aegon had recognized immediately as correct. Arthur was at the window. He had been there for an hour, looking north, not at the city, north, beyond the city, toward the distance the window could not show him but that he appeared to be looking at anyway, the way men looked at things they were calculating rather than seeing. Aegon set down the letter he was reading. He looked at Arthur. What did it say? Arthur did not ask how he knew. He had stopped being surprised by that several years ago. The Night's Watch reports movement beyond the wall, he said. Things the Rangers have never seen, things that do not behave the way living things behave. He paused. 3 Rangers sent out. 1 returned, and what he described the Lord Commander has not put in a raven before. Not once. Not in 20 years of commanding the watch. Aegon set down his pen. He looked at the stack of correspondence, at the chamber around him, at the red keep settling into the silence of a building adjusting to new occupants. He thought about the map Arthur had drawn in the dirt of the Dornish courtyard, the one that showed the choke points of the realm, and the wall drawn across the north of it, always drawn last, always in the position of the thing you addressed after the other things were handled. Not after. Now we have a kingdom, Aegon said. Yes, Arthur said. He turned from the window. He reached for the white cloak on the chair where he had left it and settled it across his shoulders. The small adjustment of a man putting on something he had worn long enough that it was no longer clothing but function. He looked at Aegon across the chamber, at the boy he had carried out of a dying woman's arms in a tower in the mountains of Dorne, at the king his student had become, at the thing 15 years of specific and total effort had produced. We have a kingdom, Arthur said. We have armies. We have the north at our back and the south at our feet, and a king who has been trained for exactly this. He crossed the room and stopped at the edge of the table, and his eyes held the same quality they had always held, the certainty of a man who had seen the end of every problem he would ever be given and was proceeding toward the conclusion. Jon Arryn spent his last months asking questions. The Night's Watch is sending ravens it has never sent before. The wall has stood for 8,000 years, for a reason that the realm has spent 8,000 years trying to forget. He picked up the raven's message from the table. Read it once more. Set it down. Now, Arthur said, we fight the war you were born for. The fire in the hearth was low. The city outside was quiet. Somewhere north of the wall, in the dark beyond the dark, things moved that did not behave the way living things behaved, and the realm had a king for the first time in 15 years who had been built rather than born into the position, who had been educated in the specific arts of impossible problems, who had been raised by a dead man to be ready for exactly this. He was ready. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.